So here we are, another video of the watercolor end of these holiday drawings that I did recently. Just finished them, just mailed them out. I do these I'd say every 9 months or so. I do them for cheap, and I try to get out as many as I can. This was a friend of mine whose property burned down in California, and he wanted to commemorate the burning of his property. But anyway, this is mostly a watercoloring of an ear, a gross ear that I did, but here you go. This one was a portrait that I did for a friend. I almost always, whenever a color is going to be red or warm or even sometimes green, when you want to make it bright, you want to make it pop and stand out, I generally do a base coat of yellow first, because without that it ends up being dull and kind of crappy looking. This is a quick example of how I sort of fade the edges, which you couldn't see. So the majority of this video is just going to be me painting this ear. Somebody wanted a gross ear, and this is the final drawing. I didn't do a video of the drawing because, I don't know, leave a comment. Tell me if that sounds interesting. The drawing, I think, actually takes the longest because it's kind of a lot of erasing and a lot of starting over. But if you want to see that, let me know, and I'll do one of those. These are 8 by 10 inch watercolors where I'm not using any pen and ink. Instead, I'm just going straight from pencil to watercolor. And it's not just that it saves time. Pen and ink does take a lot longer to do, and it's actually, of the 3 phases in making these, if I use pen and ink, it's pencil, which is sort of the invention process, and then pen and ink, which is the sort of perfecting, and I guess it's still an invention part, but it's also a correction part, and it sort of makes everything super, super clean and graphic, and then watercolor phase. So I love the pen and ink most of all, and I eliminated it in this series just because I think because I wanted to do drawings that are a little less graphic and a little more sort of artsy-fartsy, and it's sort of more of a challenge because when you watercolor a drawing that doesn't have hard black lines, the watercolor has to define each object in space with color. Even though there are pencil lines, they kind of fade away once you put a lot of color down. And you'll see that once at the very end of this drawing, you won't be able to see, even though these lines are pretty dark, you won't be able to see them pretty much at all unless you really look for them. They won't pop out at you like they do here. So for the cools and the warms, the base colors for the cools, for this is blue, and then yellow for the warms, sort of pinky, peachy color that I wanted to paint the ear, and this throbbing vein, I think that's called a tragus. You know that part of your ear that you can stick your finger on and push it in, and it sort of covers your ear canal? That's the tragus, and I like drawing it as like kind of direct as That's one of the many palettes that I use. I haven't been going to my studio much. I've been working from home for tons of reasons. You can imagine why. Because of COVID and kids at school, at home, school at home, homeschool. Yeah, I have a whole bunch of crazy little palettes that I've been using, which is just fine. It totally works fine. And so here, this is actually an experiment that I did. I decided to try and watercolor most of the ear without going over it in yellow first, and I kind of regret it because I ended up being able to pop the color out, and that's partly because of what colors were surrounding it. Every color you see is, you can really only see it in relation to what's next to it. If you paint like a red line and there's a blue line next to it, it'll look much different than if there's the exact same red line and there's a yellow line or a green line next to it. Anyway, I didn't go yellow on the ear here, and I kind of wish I had. I mean, it just makes it look completely different than if I had, and so I don't regret it, but it looks a little bit dirty in the end. And that's partly because I probably over watercolored this a tiny bit. But I don't know if you noticed, but at one point I go over a line sometimes, and what I'll do is I will sort of with my finger, if it's dry, I have really sweaty hands, so if my finger is dry enough, I can like kind of push the color back into the line if I do it just right, and it'll totally work, unless the times where it doesn't work is when what are we doing here? Either have a wet finger because of sweat, or a color that I had just fixed earlier and that color gets smooshed into the paper and I forget that it's there. Anyway, you also notice that there's a slight color variation. It's just not just a smooth wash inside the ear there. It kind of is pink with white. I kind of like to vary the color so that you're kind of tricked into thinking that there's depth there. So once I get more layers here, if you can't already tell, I go tons and tons and tons of layers. This video, this portion, I sped this up by 2, and it still took 38 minutes, and it still was maybe 1/3 of the time it took to finish the ear in watercolor. So I go kind of slow, and I go in layers. That's how I build saturation and color. And yeah, so I like to fade one color to the next. So what I prefer is to not have hard color lines. So when you draw a bead of wet color, you can see how when I pull my brush off the page, if it's an open space, there's like a wet little puddle there, and I try to, you think sort of strategically every time you dip your paintbrush in the watercolor and the paint and the water. You have to know exactly how much material, how much water, and how much pigment is in that water every single time, so that you're not sort of surprised and you can control it and pull it out. The watercolor dries really quickly, especially in the thin layers that I do. And if you are pulling a wet bead of color across an area, a surface area on the paper, if you don't continue to keep that end of the bead wet, like I generally do here, you can see I'm kind of pulling all down into one area without touching other areas that I don't want it to go. Oh, sorry for the cropping here. Then it'll be nice and smooth, and I won't have any like hard unintentional watercolor lines. And then another trick is to make sure you have enough of the color that you're using mixed, because sometimes you can run out of color, and then you've got to quickly mix colors super fast on the fly so that your bead doesn't, I call it a bead, that's because of what I've heard it called before, but it's like a bead of water, so that doesn't dry along the way. You can see I had a big area here, so I put you can see there's a ton of water there, but I know I'm going to pull that across relatively quickly. The other thing I would say is make sure you use decent paints, decent brushes, and decent paper, because you're going to get a consistent look and you're going to have more control. The brushes that I use are pretty much always Kolinsky Sable, which I think is like a weasel in Russia, and I've used so many different kinds of brushes, and I've never had a watercolor brush that comes even close to the Winsor Newton Series 7 Kolinsky Sable brushes. It's got a snap so that the brush, when you pull it off the paper, it doesn't stay bent. That's important for control, and it holds a ton of water. inside the brush so that you can put a little bit of water on and you can pull it down one particular surface for length without running out of water. And I've been using these for, you know, more than 2 decades, 25 years now, and I know them, they're all consistent, and I know them so well, so I know exactly, and it just takes experience and using the same thing for a long time, but you know exactly how much water is on there and how long it's going to last and stuff like that. Depending on my brush, this is a number 4 that I'm using. It's pretty small. This brush will last me, if I take care of it, which sometimes I don't, it's about $40, and it will last me a few years. I don't do that much watercolor, but I don't do huge surfaces. You know, if you're going to do a large surface, it's not going to last very long. If I do little, you know, this is an 8 by 10 inch drawing, so this will last a pretty long time. So yeah. So all these little, I guess I won't call them veins because maybe they'd be blue, these arteries sticking out of the lobe of the ear. I have a palette with just a bunch of reds and yellows and pinks, and I just slowly brush over those as each one dries. I'll go over the same tube and like artery in one red and then the next red, and then you just kind of mix them up. You don't necessarily have to think about it. Here's the ear. Here's I'm playing with earwax. Oh, there's like a little nodule holding the earwax in. That's going to be like a pink, like tumor thing. I like those 4 lines in the bottom. I like to imagine those are earrings that were ripped out of the ear. Sort of the idea behind that. Looks like a grill of a car, sort of. That's supposed to be a giant blackhead. Black's actually a hard color to mix. Blacks I generally, when I want to mix, I never use black or white watercolor. I always mix my own. Well, I don't mix white. I just use the white of the paper. But black is hard to mix because I go so thin that it just ends up being like a light gray. I generally, the quick way to get a black is to go with a purple and a green with a little bit of maybe cadmium red or quinacridone red. And you just go over it in layers, layer until it gets darker and darker and darker. Now this is a large surface and I don't want it to be so flat looking because it's curvy. So as I pull these beads across, I'm trying to introduce new subtle colors to it. Just like when you look closely at your skin, it's not all one color, it's several colors. There's shadows and there's highlights and there's curvature of the surface, and it changes as the surface curves. I should have made that purple artery blue, I guess, but I didn't. No regrets. Yeah. Oh, the earwax. So, yeah, I wanted to make the earwax nice and voluminous, and so what I did was made it bright yellow with some reds and then some dark browns to kind of show that they're highlights, which you'll be able to see a little more clear at the end. Those little sketches, doodles in the bottom, those will be cut off the drawing, or at least folded under, and then whoever who bought this, thank you, Jason, for commissioning this. They will have the choice to keep the little sketches. I mean, when I go to a museum, that's one of my favorite things to do is look at, there's some famous Rembrandt etchings where you can see his little doodle sketches in the corner, and it's like a secret little conversation he's having with the viewer. I love that. It's like getting inside the artist's head. And those sketches, those on the bottom, are how I drew the top part. And this isn't for like a magazine. This isn't like a final piece of art for consumer consumption. This is artsy fartsy art for art's sake. And so I like to include that stuff. It's like a little bonus thing. The most important part of my art practice are my sketchbooks. As if you've seen any of my videos, a lot of them are sketchbook centric. And that's like a tiny little sketchbook in the corner of the drawing. So I like to try and include those now when people commission these from me, which incidentally you can do at Teplin.com. But the holiday sale's over, but I still do them, just not as cheaply. So yeah, the bottom of the ear I'm gonna make a little bit darker, and that curve around the bottom I'm gonna go even darker, just so that it looks like it's in the space that we live in, and it gets dark as it curves around the bottom. I like to play with some of these little holes and divots with color to try and emphasize them and pop them out. In a sense, I just started doing this. I don't know why it took me so long, but I'm using pencils sort of as a cheat with the contour lines to help me figure out when you're painting, my brain sort of is in one mode, and it's hard to think in other modes. So I'm thinking color, not quite as much depth and perception. So those contour lines help guide me when I'm painting. That gross sore on my finger is from heating up hot milk in a mug and then in the microwave and then pulling it out and not realizing the mug was 9 trillion degrees and getting second-degree burn. I guess if you can handle the gore of the ear, you can handle the gore of my gross finger. Anyway, yeah, so that's essentially most of the well, maybe a third of the ear, and then at the end I will show you the final version.